Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Matt Hora and the Center for College and Workforce Transitions for hosting this event. My name is Eric Grodzki. I'm with the Interdisciplinary Training Program, and we are co-sponsoring this lunchtime discussion with panelists that are from practice and from research. We're very happy to be able to bring them together today and look forward to an interesting discussion. I have some questions that I've prepared, but I also want to encourage you as we move along to feel free to jump in with your own questions or follow-ups for our panelists. So let me start by giving each panelist about a minute to introduce themselves.
All right, I'm glad to be here. My name is Tim Straight, and I'm the coordinator of the Wisconsin Internship Initiative, which is part of the Department of Workforce Development, our state agency charged with focusing on workforce issues in Wisconsin.
Good afternoon. My name is Janice Kenyatta, and I am the Experiential Learning Internship Manager for a community college in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
I'm Carrie Shandra. I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at State University of New York. I'm on the research side.
And I'm Matthew Hora, an Assistant Professor of Adult and Higher Education here at UW-Madison and part of the CCWT team.
Great. So let me start off by asking in what ways you think academic and internship experiences can be complementary or mutually reinforcing, and in what ways are those things distinct? Anyone can start.
Well, I will jump in. From my perspective, going across the state when we were setting up the Wisconsin Internship Initiative, what became clear to us very, very early is this has to be a partnership between not only policymakers, but the community and academia. We all had to listen and hear what each other were saying in order to, in my case, we were charged with increasing the number of internships that are available to college students in Wisconsin. So what we found is there are a lot of similarities when we would listen, but a lot of people were not aware of what the similarities were. We also found some distinctions. The distinctions were a little bit more well known. And so what we were trying to do and what we've set out to do in my area was bring people together and first and foremost share information and exchange information with the different constituencies that were involved. So it's been a labor of love by all means, but just simply using both ears to hear what the other parties need and what they want has been critical for us.
I think from a practitioner's point of view, one of the things that I find is that there needs to be more cohesiveness, more similarities in terms of the definition of internships and what they mean. I mean, being in this, doing this work, I get different versions of what an internship, and there's a lack of understanding as to the term itself. So I think the research could really be helpful in narrowing that definition down for most of us, most practitioners, and employers as well.
I'm reminded after the student panel that students need a lot of support in internships, and oftentimes they see worksite learning and classroom learning as somewhat distinct. We are oftentimes necessarily siloed because of how we work in organizations, and so I think there's room for us to support them by making those connections on the educational side that has some value added above what they do on the worksite.
So I'll answer from a learning sciences perspective, where ideally learners are given opportunities within their coursework to, translate abstract theory or knowledge into practice in a hands-on inquiry-based manner. Like, that's the ideal. One of the things that struck me in my research in China recently was how many professors viewed the internship as the only opportunity for the student to do that. Whereas, it's all about lecture in the college coursework. And so, from my view, one of the things that really needs to be done is to, recognize that this hands-on inquiry-based work shouldn't just be outsourced to the internship, but it also needs to be included as part of the normal classroom experience.
And could any of you give us sort of a concrete example of ways that you've seen where this works well? Instances where there is a strong articulation between the academic experience and the internship? or alternatively ways where it's gone off the rails? I think we heard one earlier about the flexible class offering.
So again, because this Chinese experience is fresh on my mind, at one of the vocational institutes I visited, most of their students don't have to do internships. They didn't feel a need to because the classroom was so inquiry and hands-on based and experiential that they brought in employers to the college to help co-teach some of the courses. And so for some of these students where traveling would be an issue or the issue of compensation, it was just a new thing for me to think about that the internship is actually part of the college experience.
And I'll just kind of dovetail onto that. We have been in businesses across the state of Wisconsin and on college campuses across the state of Wisconsin as part of the internship initiative. And one of the things that I saw very, very clearly in examples where internships really worked well from the student's perspective and the campus perspective and the business perspective was when everyone had a conversation, goals were expressed, goals were agreed on, and faculty followed up and checked in with the students. The students knew exactly where to go. Number one, if I wanted to ask one of the student panelists if they ever experienced something that did not go as planned at work and how they got through it, which I thought would have been a kind of an interesting response. But when that happens, what does the student do so that there's no mystery? It forms this cohesive unit with student learning outcomes at the center, and it's a win-win-win situation. And we have really quite a number of examples, but at the core, it's this everyone coming together, the businesses, the campus, and the student to collectively decide on goals and what they want to get out of this internship.
One of the other things that I think is an important piece, and we heard about the role of supervision at the work site, but not necessarily at the college from our student panel. And one of the trends that's stuck out in my interviews is that the faculty are often not compensated. It often doesn't happen above, or it happens above load, right? So it's really difficult for faculty to invest the amount of time above and beyond their other service and research opportunities. So in terms of suggesting best practices, I think that's something we need to think about in getting folks to coalesce, is that you need actors who are mutually invested, and that's an important piece because they are kind of connecting students directly to majors.
So a number of the students I work with focus a lot of their research on questions of equality of educational opportunities. So I wanted to bring that into our discussion. What opportunities and challenges do college internships pose for equality of educational opportunity, particularly with respect to students' family income?
I think that goes back to what we've been talking about all morning, is the paid versus the unpaid internships. And in my practice with the work that I do, I often will hear students say, well, I only want a paid internship. And I try to explain to students, and I see the big picture and I understand why, is that a paid internship is great. And I always have them laughing because I say it's gravy on top of the experience and the connections that you can possibly make during the internship experience. But it's a real issue for some of the students that I deal with at a community college, on a community college level, where I've heard them say to me, well, I have a family. Might be a mature student. I have a family. I need to support my family. I can't quit my job or cut down my hours to do an internship. I understand the benefits of the internship, but I need the money in order to do it. So money becomes a big issue, but I don't hear that from every student. It just depends on the economic situation and what's going on in the family at that time. So this is a big issue.
So besides the issue of compensation, I know in our studies here in Wisconsin, the issue of disability status has come up as well, especially if a student's expected to travel and also the type of work they're going to be asked to do. One of the things about equality and equity, though, that I think should be part of the conversation is social networks and social capital, because in focus groups we've done, especially with students in business schools, some of the students are coming to college with extensive networks through their parents, many of whom in some of these majors are very well off and very well connected to a lot of internship opportunities around the country. Whereas other students don't have those contacts and they don't have those connections. And so there's a selection bias process happening with some of these internship opportunities, because many of these students who have the networks and contacts, they don't need help from the career service office to find something. Their dad or their uncle has already found something for them.
I'm glad that you brought up disability. That's how I entered this work, is that there's a lot of federal funding to look at school to work pathways for kids with disabilities, and we know that vocational rehabilitation is a big focus. So what's interesting to me is that the payment issue is not just about compensation and equity, but it's also about a policy, a suite of employment protections that comes along with being at least a minimum wage employee, from sexual harassment all the way up to equal employment. And disability protection in the ADA is part of that suite, and it becomes really difficult, especially for students who are on disability insurance, to navigate internship payment or non-payment while also meeting classroom requirements. So I think that's something we can't solve today, but is worth putting out there.
And I would agree 100% with that. It's not something that we can solve today, but I can say, again, from my perspective, doing this work that we have done within the Department of Workforce Development, equity is something that we owe it to, again, all three constituencies, the businesses and academics and the students. We need to kind of put that in some sharper focus. And make sure that students know again and again and again that there are different resources to help them find opportunities. And sometimes searching for an internship becomes so overwhelming that students just kind of get so bogged down in all the details. But just making sure that all the available resources are out there and available to them can I think do very little harm, if any harm.
So I'm going to push on that a little bit, not the last response, but in general, I think there's a lot of agreement about equity is an issue here, and we should be concerned about it. But to some degree, some passive voiciness around this. So whose job is it to be pushing on equity, or is it anybody's job? Is it a shared objective, or are there different roles for different players, universities, the state, private organizations? How should this evolve?
Interesting question.
All right. Okay, so I will go out on a limb here. I think, and I want to label this as my opinion. I'm not speaking officially for the Department of Workforce Development here, and I think that's only fair. Those of us that are policymakers and focused on, in my case, increasing the number of internships, we have to lead by example. And we really do. And so equity and diversity and opportunity we should walk the talk with respect to making sure that all students have access to all opportunities. And one way that we do that very, very nicely here in the state of Wisconsin is we have the Affirmative Action Internship Program. The SAPE program. It is a marvelous program. These students come through with very, very rich internships, and it's just a wonderful resource, and hopefully many states have that. And again, to me, it's just leading by example. One of my hopes is that will create, or at least start to reduce the disparities.
But I think you can't start this unless you have some sort of communication. So the communication has to trickle upwards so that it can be known that these equities do in fact exist. So communication to me is the key, as I'll talk about later on in another segment I'll be doing. But that's where it has to start. And then it becomes a shared responsibility from my point of view. Once it's communicated, and then we can try to work together to rectify the situation. But it's not going to be easy. It'll take time.
I'm struck by the extent to which my interviewees talked about gatekeeping and how students can very much demand certain sets or express their preferences and act upon those preferences in strategic ways. And that's one piece of it, but faculty approving credit also are gatekeepers. And oftentimes we're unwittingly placed in a situation where we're having to make those decisions without a lot of training. And career centers can be gatekeepers too. So in terms of higher ed perspective, is that a university-wide policy? I'm not sure, but certainly as I'm trying to argue, as we see this curricular creep across disciplines, it's a conversation that should be happening, at least within majors, if not at higher levels.
Thank you for pushing, Eric. I think there's at least 3 parties that are responsible that have to think about and actually do something about this. The first is policymakers. If and when state legislatures mandate internships to get a diploma or a degree, which is happening in some states, and it's definitely happening in other countries, they need to think about this, first of all. I think for some people talking at a state policy level, these issues aren't even on the radar screen. And so they have to think about it. And then what does that mean in practice? I think for colleges and universities, there's at least 2 things that need to happen. One, I'm still deeply troubled by some of the findings that Dr. Nunley reported about discrimination at the point of hiring, and callbacks for internships. So, and I've done some research on the gatekeeping mechanisms at the HR and hiring level for employees, and how many firms are seeking applicants that fit the organizational culture, that fit the existing employee demographics. And this is something in HR training that I know it's emphasized, it's a legal requirement, but it needs to be pushed more about implicit bias and explicit bias that happens, at the HR and management levels. And also within the colleges, it's the faculty or whoever's supervising the student, it's incumbent upon them to make sure that where they're sending the student is a safe and a meaningful placement for that student. I think we heard some stories this morning where sometimes students are sent out into the world, and that may be because the student-teacher ratio is out of whack or whatever, but it's incumbent upon the academic supervisors to make sure that the students' needs are being attended to. Then we also have to talk about the employers. They have a responsibility, especially at the callback and the hiring stage, to be mindful of the disparities in our society and the fact that hiring discrimination is a reality, and to deal with it. I don't know about what leverage points you can push on to make that happen, but they also have to be part of the conversation.
Oh, thank you. I'm just looking around to see if anybody has any questions. I have more I can ask. Yeah, right here.
So, they do not have a lot of employers coming to unions and do your most mediocre. And yet those students need opportunities as well. And talk more and more about internships and how important they are. How do we as career advisors help those students find those opportunities?
Can everyone hear that in the back? Okay. So the plight of the mediocre student.
Well, with the students that I deal with, and I deal with students who do not get academic credit for their internship experiences. That's why my office was developed, to accommodate students and have a structured experience for students who do not get academic credit, but they realize the benefits of an internship. And so that's why the office was developed in my particular circumstances. But so what I've done to sort of encompass what you refer to as the mediocre student is I've developed the GPA benchmark, a 2.5, which is similar to, I guess, I don't know, maybe a C average, 75 average. So that's one of the ways that I got around it, because you're right, every student should get an opportunity, or most students should get an opportunity, if they want to do an internship. So to get around that, and it is a struggle for me at times, I will be honest, but the 2.5 sort of helps me a little bit, because then you have that so-called C student sitting in front of you, and you work with them and do whatever I need to do to coach them as far as getting an internship is concerned. And then, of course, it's easy for the 3.0 student. I always have employers that say, well, I want a 3.0 or better student for an internship. That's a no-brainer, but it's the 2.5 student that I have to work with. So a lot of that has to do with my relationship with the employer. I'll call and say, hey, listen, this student may not be a high flyer, but they're willing to do X, Y, Z to get into an internship experience and to learn. And so it's a lot of relationship building and a lot of negotiating with me and the employer and the employer. So it comes down to that relationship you have with the employers. That's from my point of view in my work.
I think from the perspective of student development, if we think the goal of an internship is to network and to develop some sort of non-cognitive or technical skills, then maybe we should push our understanding of what those internship opportunities should look like for that student population, right? We are coming in thinking that this is going to be a 40-hour-a-week or 20-hour-a-week opportunity, but maybe we should also open up job shadowing or another way for employers to build relationships and for students to get an idea of what happens in the work site without having them commit to an employee that's not a great match for them as well. So maybe that's part of our thinking in terms of policies, right, is that there are internships are by definition somewhat ambiguous, right? They're very fuzzy around the edges, and maybe there's a way we can think creatively about how to serve the needs of all students a little better.
So one of the many things that struck me about the Chinese example is a number of employers there think about internships in two different ways. One is a recruitment pipeline where they're just looking for the top of the class. And the other is some internships for these firms, and in most cases they're being subsidized by the government. They're viewing them as an educational service that they provide to a university or a college. And so the ones that are kind of put in the recruitment pipeline, they're doing really high-level tasks. They're being looked at as future employees. The ones that are in the educational experience, it tends to be more low-level, more students, to one worker or mentor. So it's questionable, I think, about the value of some of those mass educational experience internships that I heard about. But it was one of the first times I've heard about a single firm kind of having two different tracks for interns.
And then I will just take off my policymaker hat here and talk as a former faculty member. This is where you depend on all of the work and the effort that Career Services has put forth to develop relationships with employers. If they know and if they have the relationship with the employer, maybe the employer really doesn't need the stellar performers. They're looking for more hands-on people. Career Services, in my experience, is going to know that, and they were by far the best reference and the best resource for those students that are not performing in the upper 25% of the class. So that was my experience with that.
I'm going to follow up on this for just a moment. So we were talking about sort of the mediocre student, but then of course there's the other end, right? So you've got your high flyers, your mediocre students, and to be charitable, let's call them your other students. So if we think everybody should have an internship experience, how do you help the other students, the students who might be below C? And I'm thinking in particular, Janice, you made the point that it's the relationships, and Tim doubled down on this, that you cultivated. Mm-hmm. Do you then use those relationships to help students sort of who have been struggling academically? Or do you worry that you compromise those relationships by saying, you know what, Eric, you should try Eric. Even though he's like pulling a D, he's your guy.
Well, I have to be honest.
Yes.
When you say D, I don't necessarily meet with those students. I am held to that standard that we came to an institutional agreement that the student would have to have a certain GPA in order to go out on an internship under my watch. So I can't really speak to that because I don't. But what I will say, though, I do meet individually with every student that goes out of my office to do an internship. I will never send a student out just based on what I see on their transcript and what the employer is looking for. So it's very important to me in my work that I match up the student's abilities and characteristics with the employer. That's real important for me. So I spend a lot of time with student engagement. So to answer your question specifically, it's just a lot of talking, but at the end of the day, I'm tired of talking because that's my work, to try to place these students in these, these viable positions. And that's how it is with me. You got questions, Becky, I know.
I appreciate that response because, as we talk about mediocre students or D students, I automatically go to a holistic approach about, well, what's happening with this? Maybe they have an island of expertise in a certain area, but are not performing well in the classroom. And so I appreciate you sharing that really it's about finding out what are those skills of the students and then matching it with the appropriate experience.
And then I would add to that, really working with a student to tell them that it is okay to highlight, and to kind of frame, the point of reference that puts them in a better light. You have to be ethical about it, of course. But the other thing that kind of struck me, there was some conversation about skill sets and portfolios and all that sort of stuff. That might be a way that we could get students and help guide them into a situation where they might be slightly more successful.
I'll head over here. Yeah.
I just think we have to be careful about assuming there's a real direct correlation between high-performing students and high-performing students in an internship. I coordinate the internships for our department, so I see all the feedback from the employers. And a lot of the students I have for other classes. So when I get those feedback, I'm expecting to get basically, well, this, it's a really good student. I have a really good student. I figure high feedback. Not always the case. The students that really struggle in my class get some of the best. And I haven't researched it to see if, how strong a correlation. But it's not as, I don't think, anywhere near as strong as we assume. So I think we have to be careful that our good students are going to be good in the internships, and they deserve the best internships because I don't see that.
Unnecessary.
And it sounds like this sort of goes back to the point that Janice was making about knowing the student and having that conversation.
Right. Yeah, it's much more important than other courses.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Back in here.
I wanted to ask, because I think a lot of us have learned extremely important information. Like I've been writing down everything religiously. And basically, how do we take this and create impact? Because obviously I feel like we all here, we're preaching to a choir. We all believe in students, we believe in access to internships, but we don't always have the decision making at the university to allocate $200,000 for a new internship program. That's up to the provost or the vice provost. So how do we take this information and take it to some of the decision makers that can make that happen? If that makes any sense.
I would love to answer that question. So what we
Which hat will
and
you
I'll
be wearing?
speak
Is
from
this the state hat? Or
yeah. This is now I'm put back on my state policy hat. What we did, it was kind of a ground up. It was kind of this grassroots thing, and it percolated up to the legislative level. And we had some elected officials that were brave enough to make a commitment at the state level to create the Wisconsin Internship Initiative. Now, it is really, truly a state-sponsored resource to work with all three college systems that are operating in the state of Wisconsin, the technical college system, the private college system, and the state university system. And it is a clearinghouse, and it is a resource for kids in Wisconsin that need and want to do an internship. So advocacy, it was my understanding that the impetus for the initiative was in fact small rural employers that had extremely dynamic and rich learning opportunities they really couldn't find full-time employees for whatever reason, lack of workforce mainly. And then they thought, well, an internship would be perfect for this. And look at all the experience that the intern would get. But how do we get our internship known? They're going to come away with an incredible learning experience. They're going to gain experiences that they would have never had in the classroom. It was advocacy at the legislative level. It went up through chains, and as far as we know, there is not another state that has anything exactly like ours. Now, there's some that are coming along. I just found one yesterday that I was not aware of in Minnesota that is for STEM. STEM only. But this is a whole-scale initiative, and it came from the ground up, and it's got legislative support and the support of our governor, too.
So if I could build upon that really quickly, I think one of the ulterior motives of this symposium was to educate policymakers, provosts, chancellors, the decision makers, about how difficult this really is in practice. Because what I'd love to see in our state is, with this initiative, have it be attached to, in this era of austerity and budget cuts, substantial resources allocated to the tech college system and the UW system, for example, to hire adequate staffing across the college, within departments, I'm not sure, but resources, the human capital to actually do the work and work with the students and develop those employer relations. Because what I find sometimes when I hear at the legislative level is this assumption that internships are easy, that it's just a technical problem, let's create a program and that's it. But as we're hearing today, and we've heard all morning, it's a very challenging design problem within an organization like a college or university. So yeah, we're hoping to take something like this on a road show, like visit the offices of legislative staff and policymakers to say, this is what the research is showing, and this is how much it costs.
If I could piggyback on that, Carlos, you know the importance of collecting data and using data to inform, to push levers and to inform practice. For me, as a quantitative sociologist, I use Bureau of Labor Statistics data. That's my bread and butter. That's oftentimes what we do as secondary survey analysts as well. And this information isn't there. So part of the reason we're struggling as a research community is there's no internship question in the current population survey. There's no in-depth information about internship experiences in any student survey that is nationally representative. So we're all kind of doing what we can to figure it out on the fly, but because there's so many actors in this puzzle, it's really difficult. So just like to add a plug for, I do think it's really important, but we don't even have a grasp on what that looks like at the market level, and we need to get there.
And I could not agree more strongly with that. We get asked literally on a monthly basis from the governor's office, from legislator, I mean, and even within the DWD and the Department of Administration, people that kind of oversee our operations, requests for quantitative data. And just to try and find it and to make it useful for people that in fact are going to make policy-related decisions on it, it is a very, very nebulous task, just to say the least. And so just even beginning to assemble the information that is useful, that would be easily accessed so that people can take it and start to inform some of their decisions. Today is a wonderful first step with that. The need is great. The need, I think, would be very, very well received. But maybe to some extent, it just takes something like today to start to do it. And I think it would be very welcome for us to push that as far as we could.
I have some questions back there.
Go ahead. Did you want to call on someone?
No, I said they
Yeah.
had their hand.
Renee.
Thank you. Dr. Hora, thank you. You commented on something I wanted to bring up. I do feel that while internships, I think, have a huge importance in some majors and for some students, some departments, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. And to have legislative mandates stating that all students need to have these, I just don't think are appropriate, and especially without any financial backing to do this. As a university with 3 career specialists and 8,000 students, I would love to have rich relationships with our students, alumni, and employers. It's just not possible. So until we get some more backing, I don't think that's possible. And then also to Dr. Kenyatta's first statement, I really appreciate that he said we can't do this until we have definitions in place as to what defines what an internship is. I think there are many other opportunities. Students need experiences, relevant in-field experiences, which could take the place of a summer field experience. It could take the place of a co-op, or some of the work that they do when they volunteer in schools or hospitals or whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be something deemed an internship. And again, we can't even define that yet because there's not an internship definition that I think is widely accepted not only by universities, but by the employers that bring our students in. So there's a lot of stuff going on. To have a legislators tell us on campuses what to do, I think isn't appropriate. I think it should be something that's departmental even, or university-based. But let us do our work. Let us do the work that we do to help these students succeed. I want full resumes on all my graduating students so that they can be successful out there, but to have it be a mandate, I just don't feel that that's appropriate.
Questions? Well?
I have a question. I'm curious what the research says or what the experience has been related to people who supervise college interns, their identity as co-educators. Because, I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about, you know, they have to have it's about learning experience, kind of discipline or soft skills, and I'm just wondering if there's a culture of, you know, have we asked if they identify that way, or it just like occurred to me when I was listening to everyone, I was like, I wonder if that's the way intern sites think of themselves.
So I could take a stab at this. This is one of the infuriating but also fantastic aspects of academia. One of my other research studies is about how workplace trainers in the firms view non-cognitive skills in their training. And you know, I'm in my little silo of educational research and higher ed research and anthropology. There's a huge literature on workplace training and how trainers at the job site think about all these issues, but it's definitely not in conversation with the higher ed literature, much less the internship literature. So I think that's one of the challenges. I'm not sure we have a workplace trainer here, do we? Like somebody that actually runs training at a firm. And so they're out there, and they probably need to be part of this conversation. How they identify themselves, that's a fascinating question that I don't know the answer to, but I think that's important. Do they view themselves as mentors, as educators? Or, as we found in some of our field research, interns are kind of an annoyance, and they don't view themselves as a mentor to this person, this young person or an adult. And so that's something definitely that has to change at some of these firms where they don't see themselves as co-educators.
And I'd like to add to that. In the work that we did with the Internship Initiative, talking with employers, that was one of the biggest fears that employers had. Oh my gosh, what will I have to do if I bring in interns? Will I do it right? What is it that I have to do? What if I do it wrong? Will the intern not get X, Y, or Z, or will I get in trouble? It was a fascinating question, and it was something we certainly never anticipated when we were setting up the internship initiative, but it's something that's very, very real. And what we are doing right now in my area is referring, we refer a lot of employers to the rich resources that career services have. But then I hear, oh my gosh, but we only have so many hours to get the work done, and we're getting, there's more and more demands on us. So there's kind of this need for maybe pulling together a few more resources that are easily accessible for the co-educator role as well, and then maybe just getting information out there, what is expected, you know, and what is not expected from people that are supervising interns out in the field.
So this question about research and practice has come up in a few different ways, and I want to push a little more on that. Starting with Tim and Janice on closer to the practice end. In what ways, if any, does research in this field influence what you're doing? And if you have any concrete examples, even better, but if you don't, that's okay.
I guess I would begin to answer that question in the following way. We want more research. We look for research. Even today, I have many more resources than coming in this morning. But one of the comments this morning is that the research is kind of in little bits and pieces scattered all over. It's not in a collective area. So I think if we would begin to have something like that, the research would have a much larger role on the policymaking side. I expressed a few minutes ago, I get requests from it, from people, elected officials all the time, and we're always at a loss. And then we feel bad that we can't provide that for them. And so I think right now, if I were pressed, I would say it has an impact. It could have a much larger impact if the research were accessible to practitioners.
I totally agree. As a person who was thrust into this position, I shouldn't say thrust because I applied for it, and I look forward to it. I don't know why I use that word, but
Everything looked
I
great
felt
then.
thrust. But I started an internship office at a college that there was no internship office. So I had to rely heavily on research. They showed me an office and said, well, here you are. And that was it. I went immediately to the internet, and I wish I had your information, Dr. Hora, that you did with the research, because it wasn't out there as much. That was 5 years ago. And I tried to rely heavily on the research. What is experiential learning? What are other universities and colleges doing as far as experiential learning? Is that a major priority for community colleges and universities? I had all these questions in my head, and I needed to rely on research. So, and I didn't find as much as I would like to have discovered at that time. I notice now is 5 years later, there's a lot more research out there now, and I'm very happy about that. So I relied heavily on, which I'll talk about this later on too, on other people in my field, colleagues who my counterparts in other colleges and universities who were involved in this, this internship phenomenon, and that was real helpful. But it would have been really great to have more evidence-based research for me to build upon, the office upon. So I agree, more research definitely needed.
And now, fair is fair, so to our research colleagues, how, if at all, do the problems of practice that folks like Tim and Janice encounter influence your research? And if you could give a specific example, even better. Yeah, it was all funny like a minute ago.
I think that's just happening now, where we launched our study based upon some of the prior empirical research, but not in as much conversation with practitioners as I would have liked. So I think it's meetings like this and conversations like this where we hear, you know what, we really need to focus more on, the role of the supervisor at the job site. Just having that line of communication with the field of practice is been a really important first step. But I have to admit, it's a slow step for a lot of researchers because it's not something instinctually you do. First you consult the literature, you write your grant, you design your study. Oftentimes, and this is why participatory action research or design-based research is so important, and maybe it's something we should talk about more as a research community, is involving stakeholders in that early stage of, what should our sample be, what should our methods be? But that's just me talking, I haven't done it yet. But hopefully we can do that in the future.
So for me, I became interested in internships because I had a really bad experience. And this was pre-internet, so also not a lot of resources for me. And as a budding sociologist, I said, there's something strange about this, and we don't really know what to make sense of it. And as I've kind of started getting into statistical data, we know, we have strong evidence that students who do internships are more likely to be employed, they're more likely to have higher wages than students who don't, but then the question is why? So then you look at job ads. Okay, well, employers want this, but why? So then I talk to employers, and then Career Center folks want this. They're an important piece of the puzzle. So for me, what I'm struggling with now, trying to make sense of that whole infrastructure, is that there are so many communities and we're all so siloed. It's really, it's hard to bring us all together in dialogue, which is why I appreciate today's opportunity. But that's, you all told me about 17 different professional organizations that I didn't know about this morning, and I don't know how we start bringing all those voices together.
This question is for Janice, but I also welcome the perspective of other people in the room. I work in an office that has, all of our students are required to do an internship. So when I get asked for data, I can pull it pretty easily because we track all of that. So my question for you is, working in an office where you're working with students who aren't doing credit, how are you tracking it? And I ask that from sort of a larger UW-Madison perspective, because we're starting to hear rumblings of legislature or things like that are wanting to learn about workplace experiences and how to track them when they're not for credit, and we can't wrap our heads around that as a whole campus of how do we start to get a handle on people who are doing things that we have no formal way of tracking. So I don't know if anybody else is tracking non-credit experience.
Yeah, I do keep reports, and I have to keep reports because everybody wants to know, well, what are your numbers? What are you doing? You know, quantitative data is important. So I do keep reports on student placement. I have an ongoing spreadsheet on every student that I place, whether or not they complete it, because, you know, students sometimes will start an internship and for whatever reason, they won't complete it. I'll keep that information as well, and it depends. It varies from student to student, but most students do complete. So I have that information in terms of completers. I keep information on whether or not they're, on what their ethnic status is, so we can see that we're equitable and fair in terms of placing students in internships. I keep records on the majors, the programs of study, where they can, you know, where they're coming from, which students are coming in for internships. Would it be the business administration students? Would it be the technology students? So I keep all that information, and that helps me to do my work better when I know the demographics of what I'm dealing with. I also keep a database on employers that I deal with. I keep that every year, and oftentimes I'm asked for reports to report that out. I get paid through the Perkins grant. I don't know if you all know about Perkins. So they want to know, well, what are the statistics of what's going on in terms of the data from your office. I'll oftentimes send it to just about everybody. Whoever wants that information, I have it available for them. So.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
After she does, she's been super patient.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Strait, I'm just very interested to hear more about your internship initiative. I don't know a lot of details.
I can give the elevator pitch, sure. Okay. So the Wisconsin Internship Initiative was formed by Wisconsin Act 283 that was signed into law in March of 2016. What we were created to do within the Department of Workforce Development is to devote a staff of 2 to increase and coordinate, first of all, increase the number of students that are placed in internships in the state of Wisconsin, and number 2, to coordinate with businesses, the workforce development boards, colleges and universities, to at least begin to have a platform where ideas could be exchanged, and we would bring people together to discuss internships through a series of events. We also were required to develop a portal where Wisconsin businesses could place their internships. As of this morning at 7:20, we have 2,083 internships listed on the portal. 93% of them are paid internships. And we have 1,921 employers listed on the portal. We are a fairly new initiative, but enjoy an awful lot of support, not only from the 3 college systems in Wisconsin, but businesses and workforce development boards, and certainly our elected officials. It's a concerted effort to increase internships in Wisconsin and hopefully prevent the brain drain. Like we saw on Dr. Nunley's maps this morning, how can we keep kids in Wisconsin and in Wisconsin businesses?
Matt.
So it's a question for Janice, and it gets to a couple of the other questions, and I think touches upon an issue facing the research community. Is there a standardized definition of what an internship is at your campus across departments or disciplines?
We are working on that right now, and we just had a conference call Wednesday morning about that. An institutional definition and we went through this, just to digress a little bit, we went through this when I was first hired into the position. And now we're back to the definition again, because of guided pathways, to get a clearer definition of experiential learning and where job shadowing and internships and practicums and all that stuff, how it fits into the the initiative, how we can make the experiences better for students so that they can graduate. So that's all still in conversation mode right now.
Yeah, I ask in part because I know that a lot of my data from China are going to be bad data, because what is considered an internship in some of these colleges, I don't think is an internship. But there's no standardized definition. Right. And many universities and colleges. And across studies and different disciplines, there's definitely different assumptions
Yes.
about what an internship is.
Yes, if I can add to that very quickly, I deal with a lot of international students who come to the college for a year to get a specialized diploma, and one of the criteria for the scholarship is to do an internship, and they all descend upon my office in August, and I let them know, you're not getting, they have to do 75 hours. That's not an internship in my eyesight. That is an experiential learning, some sort of experiential learning, or maybe project-based project that they would have to do in their particular field while they're here at the college. So, so that's something else that's in discussion, how we can change that to reflect the experiences that the scholarship program, the international organization wants for the students. So it's real confusing when you see the larger picture.
Can I further complicate that? Go ahead. So Eric has some great data that asks students what internships are and also asks them repeatedly if they've done internships, and I've had the privilege of analyzing this data. And students call volunteer experience internships, they call research opportunities internships, but most fascinating to me is when they're asked at the end of their first year in college, have you done an internship? Of those students who have actually done an internship or have said they have, 2 years later, they're asked again, and a third of them say no. Oh. So it is a moving target as to what students even define as this.
There are measurement challenges.
Yeah, there are measurement challenges. And we get there is a definition as to how they're evaluating. It's consistent over time.
Yeah, we asked the same question. We
Yep.
even defined it for them in that question.
Yep.
We being Carrie, because she wrote the question. You have a question?
Yeah, we just have a new university president, and he met with the freshman convocation and gave his speech and vision for them. One comment that he made that I thought was somewhat shocking because of the emphasis that's been true at our university is he cautioned freshman students from taking on an internship, that they might be missing out on some of the university experience, and that the internship would distract them from that experience. They'd have 3 other years where they could do at least 2 other years to focus on perhaps getting an internship. So my question is it possible to have too much internship? I mean, we've been talking about trying to get at least one internship as a theme, but is it possible to have too much emphasis on internship for students? What's enough?
My policy is I don't place first-year students in internships. In my opinion, they don't have a skill set. They don't have a foundational skill set in their programs. Oftentimes in the first year, they're taking the courses, the basic foundational courses, English, speech, communications, or whatever it is that they need, basic math, and so they don't have a skill set. So if I'll use an example, a graphic design student comes to me, a communication design student, in first semester wants an internship, what can you offer an employer? So that it just stands to reason that my policy is that they have to be a second-year student. So that's a no-brainer for me. First-year students do not get entertained. Now, for job shadowing experiences, I would entertain, or I would sit down with the student. Let's talk about how we can get you a job shadowing experience. But the word internship, in my eyesight, is a little more structured and requires a little more of a skill set in order to take to an employer. That's my take on it.
All right, we're about, go ahead.
So I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about how can we make research policy informed, and what are some of those policy questions that we could use research to answer that you're hearing, I think, on the practitioner side?
You talking to me?
Well, I think both of us.
Okay.
Well, sir?
What? No, go ahead.
Okay. So by far, the question that, from a policy perspective, I would just love to have answered is, number one, I get this question more than you would ever imagine. What is the return on investment for an internship? And I don't, if anyone else has another source of data, I think the one that I found was like 1971. And it was old, and I was like, oh, I can't really put that one out there. But really, what is the economic benefit in clear, concise, end-user friendly language, or helping us develop some end-user friendly language about the ultimate benefits of internships? We were fortunate that we had people that kind of bought into an internship and the importance of internships, so that made our path a little bit easier. But for organizations or entities that maybe the path is not quite so easy, I think that research question would be wonderful. I think we also would need to have a clear, again, user-friendly information and data on equity and diversity. And more importantly, from my perspective, how can that be mitigated? Can it be mitigated? And how can we suggest that we at least reduce some of the horrific things that we heard today? I think that would get some really nice traction as well on the policy side. But economics, the economics of internships.
I think for me, one of the things that resonates with me is bridging that gap between employers and educators. Are educators educating students or giving them what they need in the modern workplace? Because we all know, because of technological advances and so forth, the workplace is not the way it was 20 years ago. Are students being prepared sufficiently for what's going on in the workplace? And is that being reflected through their internships? That's a big question for me in terms of what the research could reveal in that aspect.
Is there someone over here who goes? Yes. Last question. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Dale Brown, junior psychology major at Tennessee State University. And this question is for Ms. Janice. So, you said that you don't allow first-year students to be placed at internships because of lack of skill set. So,
There are exceptions, but
okay.
That's
So, because once you graduate into the job market, employers are looking for their 2 to 3 years experience. So, without putting first-year students, you not feel like that sets them back. And coming into college, I feel like they have some type of skill set, whether it be communication, lively personality, Microsoft Word, that being placed in the internship that can help polish those skills. And yeah, it helps them find like what they're looking for, because a lot of first year students aren't sure what they want as a career. So being placed that early can help them find that way.
Well, there's two ways I get around that. One is the job shadowing. I'll suggest to them, well, why don't you try job shadowing, which is short, 1 to 2 days, maybe 2 weeks. I've had students do 2-3 week job shadowing experience so that they can determine, is this what you really want to do? Because that is the focus of job shadowing. However, there are exceptions to the 1-year rule for me, and that depends on what that's why I meet with students, so I can get that passion, that one-on-one experience with them before I place them. And one of the things that I'll take into consideration, if they already came with some sort of skill set, and remember, we're only a 2-year college, we're not a 4-year college, so that makes a difference in my situation too. But if they went, for instance, to a career and tech ed or vocational school, high school, and they majored in electronics for 2 or 3 years, well, now they're in their first year of a community college to enhance and get a degree, an associate's degree. That person I would consider for, depending on their skill set, for an internship in the first year. So there are exceptions. A psychology student is a little gray area for me. I would have to sit down and meet with them. And that also depends on the employer. These are sometimes what the employer expresses to me. Well, we want a student to come with a skill set. So it just it depends on the situation. Yes, ma'am, you had a...
So I'm a social worker. So our approach to practicums, internship is completely different. It's not optional. It is our signature pedagogy. You do it or you're not social worker, period.
Right.
But, and this is kind of an answer to your question, I would not place a first year student in an internship, because typically if it's a bachelor's level student, they haven't even started their major classes yet. And so the idea of being able to link what they're learning in the classroom in a setting that's actually linked to what they want to do as a profession will be much more difficult if you haven't had the academic experience that you need to be able to take into a setting in order to have some type of actual experiential learning. So it's not necessarily even about what I think a student might be capable of. but it's also making sure that in terms of a learning outcome, I've prepared them.
Right.
So, we're a little over time. I want to thank our panelists and also thank everyone for